joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Duncan Robertson. He's expert in policy and strategy analytics at Loughborough University, focusing on COVID modelling. The perfect person then to speak to this morning. Good to see you. So looking at the latest data and modelling, what's your take on whether further COVID restrictions are inevitable now?
Well, it sort of depends what the government's objective is. Now, obviously, if they want to reduce pressure on the NHS and to perhaps make it less dreadful than it's going to be, then the ideal time is to put in these restrictions now. Now, of course, you know, these projections have been given to the Health Secretary since 9th of December, saying the kind of latest dates you want to have in order to essentially have the NHS overwhelmed. And I think today is the last of those dates. So it becomes more and more inevitable that you're going to get the health service overwhelmed, unless you define the health service as something that can never be overwhelmed. And that's really the only way of avoiding it.
Professor David Spiegelhalter was on Sky News this morning. He said that some modelling shows that if we stick with Plan B, so stick with things as they are now, we could see 3,000 hospitalisations a day, which is actually less than we saw in the peak last winter. What did you make of that?
Well, we've seen there are a series of projections, and they're all based on some assumptions, and they're based on the best knowledge that we have at the moment. And if we continue with Plan B, then, you know, it's not 3,000, it's between 3,000 and 10,000 emissions that we have. And the difference really with the Alpha peak in this time last year is because of this really explosive growth we've got. All of these cases are going to come in a very, very condensed period of time. And that means not only is the health service going to be under tremendous pressure from the number of cases, it's also going to be under tremendous pressure from the number of people who are off. And that doesn't just apply to the health service, it also applies to other critical services, police, fire, etc.
But of course, we're in a very different place, aren't we, to this time last year in terms of the booster vaccination programme, which is going very well, but also in terms of antivirals and treatment for COVID.
Well, absolutely. And there are uncertainties. But, you know, we don't have the majority of people with the best protection, because, of course, even if you get a booster now, it's not going to really kick in terms of the maximum benefits for about a week or 2 weeks. So really, we do have a lot of vulnerable people out there. Of course, we've got all the children under 12 who haven't been vaccinated, but we've got a significant number of the population that hasn't even had their first vaccine. So, and of course, that really, it depends on various things, including deprivation. So you're more likely not to have had your first vaccine if you're more deprived. So there's a significant number of people who are not protected. And yes, they are probably going to be the ones that are more likely to end up in hospital.
Well, children
but
are.
We are more
children,
protected by boosters,
children,
but we're not completely protected.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but children aren't more likely to end up in hospital, though, are they?
No, but they are more likely to spread the virus. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment. We've got two things. One, we've got trying to reduce the number of people who end up in hospital, and that's very much down to the booster virus, but also getting boosters. But it's also one of the things about the number of people getting their boosters is you tend to see young, relatively fit people getting their boosters and queuing up at the moment. And one of the reasons for that is they're the people who are likely to mix. And we can see that in terms of 20, 30, 40-year-olds are the sort of increases that we've been seeing most in London. And the problem comes, of course, is that once schools go back at the beginning of January, then there's potentially going to be more spread there. So you have this spread and the effect of hospitalisation. So it's not just hospitalisations, it's also about controlling the spread.
OK, Sage, very downbeat, aren't they, in their latest assessment? They're suggesting we wind the clock back to last spring, go for step 1 and 2, shutting down non-essential retail, potentially even stopping indoor mixing. It's all very doom and gloom, isn't it? I mean, is that where we're heading then, in your assessment?
Well, Sage haven't advocated any of those things because, of course, they're just there to advise the government. They're there to give the projections. And they haven't modelled lockdown. They haven't modelled the sort of schools closing, for example. So what they're doing is working on a number of scenarios based on what policymakers are telling them and projecting that forward. So rather than doom and gloom, I think it's a sense of what could happen. And it's more about being realistic than trying to hope it'll go away.
So where do you think we're heading?
Well, I think we're inevitably going to have more and more restrictions. Now, the question really is whether you want stronger restrictions for a shorter amount of period, or whether you want restrictions for a longer amount of time. So we are almost inevitably going to have some sort of restrictions, but of course, this is a political process as well. It's not as though SPI-M or SAGE can come out and recommend anything, not that they're in the business of recommending things. There's a political process for it to come through. So people can look at the restrictions that are going to be imposed on people, but they can also look at what you can do yourself. You can minimise your own contact and save up that contact for Christmas. You can perhaps be told that this is an airborne virus, and the sort of masks that people are wearing at the moment are perhaps not as good as they could be. So wearing better quality masks, if you look at Europe, FFP2 masks seem to be the ones that are used. So really it's about educating the public on what the dangers are. And of course, communication is part of Plan B. So that communication really does need to come.
Yeah, and keeping that booster programme going as well, of course. Dr. Duncan Robertson, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.